Record. And record. All right. Firing up the bumper in 3, 2. The Mind of a Geek podcast is brought to you by Inked Geek Studios. Be sure to check out inkedgeekstudios.com for this and other great shows. Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of the Mind of a Geek podcast. I am joined by Miss Abby Wessels. How's it going?
Not too bad. How are you doing?
Oh, peachy. So if this is your first time listening, this is the newest show of the Inked Geek Studios network. Be sure to check out episode 1. That was a lot of fun. And I hope you enjoyed this one as well. So I'll get started by kind of introducing you a little bit, and then I'll let you talk.
Right.
Abby's a podcast host and a geek, and that's how I know her. She's a transgendered woman, and she spends a lot of time going over news topics, challenges in the LGBT_T world.
Something like that, yeah.
And is a gamer and a geek. So the things we love about people. So why don't you tell some of the listeners, kind of define or get into that a little bit more than I did, so I'm not just narrowing you down to a sentence.
About who I am?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm Abby. I am a trans woman and a geek, pretty much. I started podcasting, end of August, I believe, is when I first started getting into it. Got my hands on a good microphone and started to podcast. I've always wanted to put my voice out there, and first and foremost, I identify as a trans woman before being a geek, and I know I personally know that there's a lot of hurdles that come with transitioning and being a part of this LGBT community. So what I've wanted to do with my podcast and with my involvement in this community is to just kind of make a resource for other people who are going through similar issues that I have gone through, and make it easier for them to find someone who can lend a helping hand, I guess you would say.
Right. Well, I mean, I was going to say that definitely seems like a noble thing to do, because it's still, we briefly brought up different things right before I started recording, but, homosexuality has become more acceptable in this society, which is great. And we're definitely going in the right direction. And
sure.
The transgender lifestyle, I hate to kind of use that word, but for lack of a better term, it's still something that's new to some folks, I guess you could say. A lot of people maybe either aren't aware that it's as mainstream as it is. I mean, obviously there have been some public figures that have, put it on headlines and front page magazines and stuff like that.
People are starting to realize that it is a thing. Understanding that thing is another matter entirely, but it's starting to get to the point where people are figuring out that, oh, hey, this exists.
Right. It's not a phase.
Super taboo.
It's not a kink. It's not
exactly
something that's done as taboo. It's who you are. No different than I'm tattooed and male, and we are who we are, and it would be nice and I even made a comment in the Tadpool Facebook page one time, where it will be nice when we get to a point where I don't want to say have to, but like, I don't introduce you as a transgendered woman. You're a woman.
Yeah.
And your license doesn't say, TGF. Like, you know what I mean?
There's a lot of people. I mean, you're going to find people from all points of this argument, but like, to be able to, I put myself out there as a trans woman, but I have a friend who doesn't out themselves as transgender, and they have that passing privilege. They're able to walk around and say, I'm a woman, and have people accept that.
Right.
And now if I walk around and say I'm a woman, there's a lot of people out there who will say, yes, but you're a trans woman.
Right.
So
it's like, well, what's the difference?
Exactly. It only matters in the bedroom. That's about it.
Right. I mean, really, if you're somebody who, you took hormones and you may, pre-op, post-op, you may or may not have gotten surgery. So you've basically taken how you appeared at one point, and through medicine and through surgery or not, you've changed to what you look like now and who you are now. How is that any different than somebody who is obese? So they take diet pills and then get liposuction. So now they're thin. Are they trans thin because they use surgery to get there? You know what I mean? It's like, well, you weren't born thin, so you're
Exactly.
you don't get to hang out in the thin community. Like,
Yeah,
it seems like an unnecessary, especially like in your position where you're looking to put yourself out there to be helpful, to be an instrumental tool to people who are going through the beginning steps of that process, or maybe even in the middle of that process, but are having difficulty. So in your position, I feel like it's important to identify with that title because it allows people to know they can come to you. Like, you're like, look, there's no reason to be afraid to use that word.
Yeah, and you're going to get, you find transgender people who, there's different mountains to climb for every trans person. I wound up facing the opportunity. I actually just graduated last weekend with a bachelor's in science and education. And now 2 years ago, I was looking into being a high school science teacher. And I came out and realized, well, I might be able to get a job in college or in California, but there's nowhere else where I would have a reasonable chance of getting a job as a high school transgender science teacher. And so that's definitely a mountain that some other trans person can climb. And definitely if they feel called to do that, I think that's a noble pursuit. However, there's different routes that people take, and there's different hurdles that trans people go through, and there's different milestones to be set.
Right. And I'm sure from a purely societal accepting point of it, and a physical point, obviously, like your stature, your body type, facial structure, stuff like that. The more feminine you are to begin with, probably the easier that transition is.
Yeah, for sure.
Very, and I know it's a completely different thing, but like in cross-dressing, for example, people identify themselves as either passable or non-passable. So if you were to cross-dress, if and be identified as passable, it's very similar to, you may have an easier time transitioning to being accepted as a female.
Yeah, definitely. Depending on where you started when you transition,
right.
Definitely has a huge effect on how well you're able to pass. Me starting at being 25 and starting hormones, I'm going to see much less of an improvement than somebody who started hormones pre-puberty, or I'm going to have much more of a visible effect than somebody who started at 45 or 50.
Right.
And results vary for everyone. Everyone has different results. Everyone has different steps that they take, and some work out better than others. But yeah, no matter what, it doesn't disqualify your identity or your gender, but it definitely does change how you're perceived by the rest of the world.
Now, so you started doing this at 25, and how old are you now?
25.
Oh, okay. Oh, so this is brand new.
I've been on hormones for 7 months now, as of yesterday, actually.
Awesome. So the transition began within this year. The transition.
That's actually the answer to one of the questions you sent me. The hormone, that step, I identified as transgender before I got onto hormones. Getting onto hormones was a process that took quite a few months of me just deciding, making sure this is what I wanted to do, and figuring out how to do it, getting myself to the point where, all right, I have the funds, I have all my bases covered, I can start this. That didn't happen just in a day. That took a while. So I've been considering, and I've been actively transitioning for about a year, considering for about 5 years, and yeah, so it's not a clear cut,
right?
And unfortunately that makes it a lot harder to explain to people.
Right. Well, it's one of those things. It's not, you go to sleep being cool with who you are one night and then wake up the next day going, this isn't right. It doesn't really work out that way.
Exactly, unfortunately.
So, okay, so the physical process started within this year.
Yeah.
And then, but the emotional process was obviously before that.
Oh, yeah. So emotional process has been going on to different varying degrees for a long, long time.
So you were identifying as woman before the transition? At least for yourself?
I knew I was trans probably when I was 23, early 24 or so, and figuring out how I wanted to go through that, figuring out what steps I wanted to take, what I was okay with, what would be all right. I mean, I am going through the most drastic change I will ever voluntarily put my body through right now. And there's no going back for it. And I needed to be absolutely sure that this was what I wanted to do. And that took a long time. I spent 4 or 5 years mulling that over in my head and figuring out, is this right for me? Is this how I identify? Will I be happy? Is this dysphoria inside of me? Is that stemming from my gender, or is it stemming from something else?
Right.
So it's a huge, long process that goes way before hormones, or starts way before hormones.
Right. So at what point, and I'm kind of curious about this because, as you said, it's one of those things, and I've read a couple different articles where, there are parents who are very accepting, and they'll, you get the early teens, mid-teens that go, you know what, I don't feel inside what I'm presenting outside. And there are parents who are supportive of that and some who aren't. And as you said earlier, the younger that they realize that and they start with the hormones and things like that, the more prominent that those changes will be when they get older. Mm-hmm. So if they know that is truly what they want to do, it's better for everybody if they are, correctly and safely doing that at a younger age. But when these, again, we talked about how it's not an overnight thing, but when the thoughts first started even maybe coming into your mind, when it was, maybe something's not right. I don't feel like something's right. How did that feel like it, as far as on a personal level, but also maybe as far as the other people around you? Because, I guess I'll let you answer that question, then I'll go with the next one.
I mean, it's incredibly... For the longest time, I knew that there was something wrong. I mean, I grew up in a neighborhood. I was born into a family where all the moms in the neighborhood got together and brought their kids, and we played and hung out once a week.
Okay.
And I wound up going, basically from birth till I was 14 years old. Every week, every Friday, we'd get together and hang out, and I'd hang out with all these kids, and I grew up with them, and some of them are my best friends. The issue is, I was one of probably 9 or 10 kids there, and they were all women. And I was the only one who was labeled male at that time. And I knew kind of at a very, very early age that something just wasn't right. Something didn't fit. There were things like they'd go off and play with certain toys or do certain things, and my mom would discourage. She never banned me from it, but would definitely discourage me from doing that.
Right.
And I knew that there was something going on, and throughout elementary and middle school especially, there was just something I didn't fit in, and it got to the point where I just had to accept the fact that I didn't fit in. Maybe because my school wasn't big enough to have a group of individuals who I fit in with. I went to a small school, so I figured, okay, I'm just an odd one out, and there just doesn't happen to be anybody else who fits with me. And that's kind of how my mindset was all through high school. And it wasn't until after high school, during my first year at college, that I started to hear this term transgender and how that was a thing. So it was a very weird feeling, because I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have a word for it. I didn't know what gender dysphoria was. I didn't know that was a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I guess, and I apologize, because this is a question I just kind of came up with, so it's not in the notes. So I apologize if I hit you unprepared.
No,
so
go ahead.
I guess One of the things that I'm curious about, the next thing I was going to ask you was when you first heard transgender, but you covered that in that answer. Mm-hmm. So my next question is, without knowing that was even a thing, let alone what it was and what it consisted of, mm-hmm. did you think that perhaps maybe you were homosexual? That you were like what? Because obviously that's more of a household term. Like, yeah. And I'm just and I guess kind of up to now. So obviously you're female. You identify as female. We identify mm-hmm. you as female. When I say we, I mean like the tadpool community.
Yeah.
Your friends, those of us that respect you and get along with you. So I assume at this point in time, you I guess
I identify as gay now.
You identify as gay now. Okay.
Yeah, and it's become such a that's just the simple way of saying this.
So you're a transgender woman that fancies women.
Exactly. Okay. Romantically, at least.
Right.
Sexually, it could go either way. It gets into the difference between homosexual and homoromantic, heteroromantic, heterosexual, that kind of thing.
Right.
I did go through a phase though in high school. I mean, I think everybody does this because it's the LGBT community, and your sexual orientation is tied very much to your gender identity. And yeah, I went through a phase where like I thought, am I gay? Am I a gay male? And I remember sophomore year of high school sitting in my social studies class, like just thinking about that constantly, and just,
right?
Like I might be gay. Like this might be the answer, but I really don't like dick.
I'm gay. I'm just the wrong gender, so I'm still gay. I just need to switch my gender first.
I was half right. Yeah.
Right. You were halfway there. You realized you were gay. You need to identify yourself to realize what you were gay for.
Yeah. Exactly.
So that's very interesting because I know. Somebody who may be from the outside looking in and not getting it. I'm mm-hmm. sure, and I wouldn't be surprised if from maybe a bigoted person or a closed-minded person, especially being in a small town, someone goes, "Oh, well, you're just a cross-dresser." So, and I guess the biggest difference there is a cross-dresser is typically a gay male who identifies as feminine or sissy or whatever the taboo term is. But again, mm-hmm. that's purely a sexual thing for the most part.
Yeah.
And that's a fetish and a taboo.
Yeah. And I think cross-dressers are typically stereotyped as gay men.
Right.
And it stems from, and I put this in the answers to the questions you sent me, like people turn to, the reason that this happens, I think, is because people turn to porn for the answer. That is what
Fair
I
enough.
did. That is what I did. That is what I hear so many people do. All of these taboo subjects that adults will not address with their kids or don't know enough to address with their kids. Well, kids can't get the answers from authority figures in their life. And they'll go to the internet and they'll look at porn and they'll see, okay, this guy is definitely gay. This is a fetish. This is a kink. This is a purely sexual thing, and it needs to be hidden. And if it ever comes out, your life is ruined.
Right.
And that's where a lot of that stems from. That's what I believe, anyways, is that porn fuels all these misconceptions.
Right. Well, yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised by that in any way. I mean, it's a fantasy world, and people don't realize that.
For sure.
And people spend so much time in it that they lose reality. And, you get mm-hmm. that senior in high school is wondering why his teacher won't bang him in the bathroom. And it's like, because it's not a porno. That doesn't happen in real life. Yeah. I mean, it does, and then you get arrested and put in jail.
Yeah, there's a few times when it does, but it never works out like it does in the porn.
No. And they're never as attractive as they are in porn either.
Yeah. Yep.
But that's interesting. So that's yes. So I assume that being said, obviously, because it's possible to be a cross-dresser or a transvestite or whatever, and be straight and male. I mean, Eddie Izzard, who ironically got brought up on last week's show with JF too. He's a perfect example of that. He's a very, he's not as flamboyant anymore, but he's a very flamboyant transvestite. Which I guess is there a difference between transvestite and crossdresser, or is it like
the way? Everyone has a different definition for each term. There's going to be variations on this. The way that I have understood it is a crossdresser is someone who dresses in women's clothing or dresses in clothing meant for the opposite gender in order to get a sexual thrill out of it. A
Right.
transvestite being someone who um, markets themselves in a sexual way and uses a feminine appearance to better sell their body.
Okay.
That's how I've understood that. You're gonna get people that have different definitions,
Right.
though.
But yeah, so I mean, so he's, he identifies as a transvestite. That's how he
Mhm.
describes himself. But he's married to a woman. He's
Yeah.
a straight male under the woman's clothing. So, or I mean, I think he says he's called himself a gay lesbian.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, so I guess you have transvestite, and transgender is a step beyond that, where it's I don't get arousal out of dressing like a woman, but I identify as a woman. That's who I believe I
Yeah.
am. And it's
I
just
don't know. I
it's
don't know if saying it's a step beyond it because I don't think they're in sequential order
well, I guess
necessarily,
that
but
wasn't
it's
the right
definitely a
phrasing,
different
right?
topic. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So let's kind of get back to that. So when you first learned of what transgender was and
Hmm.
felt that described you and your choices and the direction that you felt was right for you, how difficult was that, as far as like, because obviously with anything like that, transgender, homosexual, any major things like that where it's a big might be a shock to people, or it's just either way it's a big announcement.
Hmm.
um like, what were
Well,
the
that's
steps between becoming comfortable with it yourself and then like kind of gradually letting people know and kind of weaning out who to tell, who not to tell, and like, how was
mhm.
that process for you?
I mean, it was that gets into that period of time we were talking about where it was like 4 or 5 years of me mulling it over. I had learned everything I knew about what it was to be. I mean, at that time, I called it like I knew it as being a she-male, which was it's a term coined by the porn industry and is pretty offensive to transgender circles today. It was early 2010s that I was working in a clothing store, and instead of folding the clothes, I grabbed a Rolling Stone magazine and read the coming out story of Laura Jane Grace, who lead singer of the band Against Me. And that was the first time I learned that, okay, you can be transgender and it's not a sexual kink. Like, this is an actual thing. And it wasn't until 3 years after that that I talked to somebody about it. And I can't even remember. Like, it was probably one of my friends from college down here. I wound up bringing it up and chatting with them about it and saying I'm not really sure. Oh no, it was my ex-girlfriend. I told her that I'm questioning my gender identity and I don't know what to do about it. And we broke up about a month later. um, but yeah, it took a long time to deal with that. It was a long time of just mulling it over. And then I wound up going to therapy through my college here, going to therapy and talking about that for about 6 months before I wound up getting a letter of recommendation to get on hormones. And it was kind of a thing where very, very slowly over the course of 1 or 2 years, coming out to some very, very close friends, coming out to um, people I knew, and that turned into going to gay bars and like dressing in terrible wigs and makeup and looking like crap. Um, and you kind of move up the scale of the significant people in your life.
Right.
You tell your good friends, your childhood friends, and your parents, your family, that kind of stuff.
How did that go?
Not very well. I wound up, it was a year ago last Thanksgiving, so about a year and a month, year and 2 months ago, I wound up um, knowing that I was coming home for Thanksgiving or going to my grandparents' place for Thanksgiving, and I wound up calling my dad and saying, "Hey, we're getting together. I haven't seen you in a while. Why don't you, Mom, and I go out and get some dinner and we can talk about some stuff?" And he's like, "Okay, sure." Wound up calling my mom, told her the same thing, saying, "Hey, I'm going to be coming home. Why don't we get together and we can talk about stuff?" And immediately, of course, being a mom, it's like, "Wait, do you have something to tell us? Do you have something to say?" It's like, "Yeah, there's something I'd like to say." And
So they
she's like,
don't know at this point.
"Oh, at that point, no."
Okay.
And they're like, "Well, what is it?" Like, "I don't know where." It's like, "I'd really like to tell you in person. This is something that means a lot to me. I want to talk about it to you in person." "Well, are you gay?"
It's always the first one.
No, I'm not. And it was pulled out of me over the phone, and that was very, very painful. That's
Right.
how that happened. And um, they haven't really been supportive. I wound up hanging out with them over Thanksgiving. It wasn't a huge bonding time. It was basically just being in the same room together. And
Right.
then um, that following Christmas, so last year Christmas, about a year ago, I wound up coming home. But before I came home, I picked up a letter of recommendation from my therapist that I would give to an endocrinologist who would prescribe me hormones. So basically, a permission slip to get drugs.
Right.
And wound up posting it on Facebook with painted nails and a big smile on my
I
face.
remember that. You were very excited.
Yeah, yeah. I remember, yeah, I posted that in the tadpole.
Yeah.
Um, and I wound up getting home, and 5 minutes after, it was 325-mile drive, 5 minutes within getting home, they sit me down and they say, "What is this?" And we talk about it. And that's when it really came out that if I was going to go down this road, I would no longer be welcome in their house. And um, I had plans to stay up there. This was 2 days before Christmas, and I was planning on staying there until about a week after New Year's. Um, it was hearing that it just crushed me, and I wound up spending 2 days straight in my old room and not really interacting with the family at all, and they weren't happy about that because I came home. I should be interacting with the family.
Right.
Who cares if I got told I can't come home if I do this, but I need to be interacting with the family. My grandparents came up, and we had Christmas together, and I wound up leaving the day after Christmas because it just wasn't a safe space anymore. And
Right.
that was the last time I saw my parents. We've talked a few times.
Are they getting any more accepting or no?
No, we've chatted on the phone a couple of times. It's always started out pretty well, but as soon as I bring up transition or my name change or how the hormones are going or whatever,
Right.
I mean, they shut down. They literally just stay silent as if nothing happened. So it's not even a dismissal or a contradiction to what I'm saying. It's just nothing. Like
Just
they
kind of
didn't
write it
even hear
off
anything. So
yeah. Well, that sucks.
and
I'm
I
sorry to hear that.
it's yeah, it is what it is. It kind of comes with the territory if you're transitioning.
Well, yeah. I mean, it comes, and even like, and again, not to compare your trials to mine at all,
Hmm.
but I've gotten similar comments. Like I've been told by my mom, if I ever get a tattoo on my face, I won't be welcome in her house, and that's something that I really want to do.
You've kind of pushed the envelope. I see you got some on your neck there. So
Oh yeah, neck.
nice,
I've got them on my fingers. I'm covered.
nice.
But that's something that I wanted to do, and that I got that, and that's kept me from doing it. But obviously, that's not really that big of a deal. It's
Hmm.
not me. It's just it's artwork. It's meaningless at the end of the day. In your situation, it's who you are, and it's their complete unwillingness to accept that. Now, do you feel is it purely maybe from like just an old fashioned, like blind, like bigoted, like just not willing to even learn about it or understand it, or I guess if you were to try and maybe analyze that, and I ask you this purely for the sake of maybe somebody else listening who might be going through that, like maybe
Yeah,
understanding
yeah.
where they're coming from. I don't mean to keep kind of poking the wound.
No, you're fine. I came onto the show to have my wounds poked. Wait, what? um,
Rewind.
so let's just try and move on as fast as
All
we can from
right,
that.
let's go.
My family has always been the kind of family where if somebody walked by our family and took a snapshot, we always wanted to make sure we looked like the perfect family. There was never we never you don't acknowledge the problems, you don't deal with the problems because you just pretend like everything is fine and everything is fine. And for the longest time, I remember getting into arguments with my parents, going through the normal teenage angst stuff, getting in yelling, screaming matches with my parents, and we'd go to bed angry at each other, and we'd wake up the next day and things would be normal. We'd just go on with our life. And it was very much don't deal with problems, don't acknowledge the problems, just put your head down until they go away.
Right.
And so I think that this stems from that. I mean, it wasn't until I've got an aunt and an uncle who are very supportive, and they're about the only family I've got left, except for a cousin. And there's things with my family that have come out. I learned from my aunt about my dad's side of the family. Me being trans is definitely not the biggest thing going on with my family. There's some messed up shit going on, and I am the least of that. So,
Right.
and the fact that this wasn't even known, like I had no idea. I'm
Right.
20, 24, 25 years old, and I have no idea that any of this stuff has happened in my family. So there's definitely a bury your head in the sand until all your problems go away mentality, and I think that their reaction stems from this. I
Right.
don't know how long it's going to take, or if it ever will.
For them to realize that this isn't a problem that's going
Exactly.
away.
Or
Like,
this is something that you have to acknowledge. I don't know if they're ever
right.
going to do that or not.
Right. Be like, you have a daughter now. Deal with it.
Yeah, like you're definitely not going to get through this with your son, but
Right.
they've got to decide whether or not they want to get through this with a kid, with one of their kids.
Right. Right. And
Yeah.
I hope for their sake that they do. You
Yeah.
seem to have. I mean, I'm sure. Again, I'm sure it still kind of bugs you, and still you wish things could be different. But on the other hand,
Yeah.
you're finding who you are. You're happy. You're comfortable with who you identify as now. I mean, I remember the Facebook post when you officially got legally recognized as female, and you were very excited about that.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, even without knowing them, I almost kind of feel bad for them that they don't get to experience their child going through all this.
Yeah.
Because it's exciting for you. I mean, as somebody, I've never met you. I know you purely through the Tadpool. And, we've spoken a couple times on the Tadpool Cards Against Humanity night. But,
Yep.
but even as somebody who just knows you, and this is the most I know you, I'm excited for you. Like, that's really cool. And the fact that your parents don't get to do that, it's really their loss. They don't.
I have spent the 20 years that I lived in their house. I spent that entire time arguing with them and trying to, like, during fights and whatever, or arguments, or even innocent debates, trying to convince them, or to try and push them to see another side of an issue. And that's never been a thing I've ever been able to do before. And now there's this huge monstrosity of an issue within my family of being transgender. And being gay, they might be able to wrap their heads around a little bit, but being trans is just this huge animal.
Right.
And I'm at the point where it's like, if they come around, that's great, but I'm not going to be able to have any part in this because 2 decades of trying this hasn't worked out. So I don't think that this is going to be any different. So
Yeah, it's one of those things. And again, if it's going to work out, it is. And then if it isn't, then they're lost. And you get to live your life and be happy with who you are.
Yeah, I can't sacrifice myself completely in order to salvage this relationship.
Right.
So
yeah,
I've got other things.
Cut your losses.
Yeah,
Which sucks to say about your parents, but if you got weight holding you down, then you cut it.
Definitely.
So,
yeah.
I mentioned the legally being recognized as female. So
Yep.
what does that change? Like, obviously that's a big step. And I mean, like, what is required by law to legally, I mean, obviously as a male, I can't just walk into DHS and go, hey, I'm a female now. Like, so there's obviously steps there. Like, what's the steps into that process? And then, like, how big, if any, like, weight off your shoulders was that going, I'm finally legally recognized?
It really differs from state to state. Grew up in northern Michigan. I'm in Ohio right now. I don't know how long I'm gonna stay here. I miss trees and hills, but in Ohio, in order to change your name, I had to go to the courthouse, request a name change form, fill about 6 or 7, 8 pages of paperwork out, submit that with $95 to the courthouse. They wound up sending me my court date. My court date was like 2 months from the time that I got the letter. In that time, at least 30 days before that courthouse date, or the court date, I needed to go to a publication that was in wide circulation, so the newspaper in town, and advertise that and say, this person is changing their name to Abigail Rose Wessels, and put that in the paper, show up for my court date, and talk to a judge. I wound up showing up. The court session took 7.5 minutes
Well, that's
of
good.
him, basically saying, like, are you sober? Are you doing this to escape creditors? Excuse me. Are you doing anything illegal? No. Okay, you're Abby. And that was how to change that. In order to change the gender marker, because I also got that changed, I have a little F next to the sex on my driver's license. I needed to go to the BMV, the DMV, Secretary of State. In Ohio, it's the BMV.
Right.
Request a change of gender marker form. They didn't have that. They had to call down to Cleveland, have them fax it up. They gave it to me. It was 1 page of paperwork. I filled out half of it, and I went to my, you had to go to a psychiatrist. Luckily, my school offered free therapy. So I've been going to the counseling center every week to talk about this, because when you do something this drastic, you kind of need that.
Right, to make sure that you're in the right mind.
Exactly, yeah. So luckily, I had somebody who was a licensed therapist who knows me well enough to sign off and say, yes, definitely, this person is female. They fill out the other half of the paperwork, send it in. A week later, I get a letter in the mail saying, hey, you can go get a new license anytime now. They'll put the new stuff on there. So that was actually a lot simpler than changing my name. So, yeah.
And that obviously the ease of that came from you had a therapist that you had been talking to.
Yeah. Luckily, I was in a situation where I had somebody in an authority position that could sign off on it immediately.
So somebody in that position, although without somebody maybe who perhaps hadn't spoken to a therapist about this yet, they probably would have to sit down for a few sessions, let the therapist get to know them, and because they're not just going to sign anything. So.
Yeah, exactly. And it really depends on what therapist you go to. I wound up talking to, when I saw a therapist when I was first deciding on going onto hormones, I wound up talking to that guy for 6 months before he gave me the letter. And granted, part of that time was me deciding whether or not I really wanted to do this, because it was a very daunting idea for me at the time. So that took 6 months, and then he wound up leaving, moving to Massachusetts, and I wound up moving over to somebody else who actually specialized in LGBT issues. The guy I saw I found out like 3 months into our sessions, he specialized in people of color and anger management issues.
Right.
But he wound up having me in for like a trial session to see who I'd best fit with, but he had comic books on the wall, so we spent the entire session talking about comic books. And at the end, I was like, hey, you want to just keep doing this every week?
Right.
So I was sure, but he wound up writing me the letter after a long period of time. So different therapists are going to need different amounts of time, and it's unfortunate. They're gatekeepers, and if you're someone who's not sure about something, having that gatekeeper there to make sure that you're okay with something is a good idea. But if you're 100% sure and you are just in a very, very low place until you can get this done, having that gatekeeper there can be a hindrance too.
And that might also be preventative for some people, depending on their location. Like,
or their insurance,
well, not even insurance. Like, my thought was, like, if you are in the Bible Belt and you have to find a therapist who, so there's like, obviously, if you're on the West Coast in California, you're probably going to be able to find a therapist that will do it, or anywhere else that's progressive and more open-minded. But you get somewhere where it's that stereotypical, that backwards Southern Bible Belt or anything like that, or who knows how difficult it might be in other countries.
I've got a couple of trans friends down in Kentucky and Tennessee who, both awesome people. But yeah, I've been meaning to actually talk to them about the difference. And now that we've both been through the process, going through the different aspects and how things are different. So that's definitely something I want to look into sometime.
Right. So just so I don't have to bring up religion twice, since I already brought it up, I already knocked on the door. I mentioned to you that one of the things that intrigued me about your situation is that, coming from my perspective as an atheist, you were transgender, but at the time that I heard you say this, you said your faith was still very important to you.
Mm-hmm.
You even joked with Mark Turpin about the church of the
Church of the LGBT underscore T.
Yeah.
I actually made a flyer for that too.
Yeah, I saw that. And that intrigued me. And as I warned you in the pre-show, I'm going to repeat myself now for the sake of the listeners, but because as an atheist, you kind of on the outside looking in, and there are the inner workings of whether it be faith or the religious steamroller, either one, whichever you look at. And again, homosexuality has become more accepted, and people are accepting the fact that you're born that way. And the reason that I was intrigued as far as a transgender who holds their faith is the idea of, the way I look at it from somebody who doesn't know the inner workings, is it's you going, well, God made me incorrectly, so I'm going to fix it. And I would think that would be a little bit larger of a pill for a religious person to swallow.
Yeah, we wound up, we talked in the pre-show, and we can definitely repeat the conversation
Go ahead and repeat it, because it wasn't recording then. So
saying that, well, I was supposed to be born a woman, but I was born a male. If you blame that on God, how is that any different than, well, I was born a blonde, but I dyed my hair brunette now? And it's a different extreme, definitely, but they are the same issue at its core. It's just more widely accepted, I think. Definitely, my faith is never, and I think I mentioned this on the therapy show that I was on, it's never truly reflected any definition of what church is. My faith and the Christian church are two very different things, and have pretty much always been like that. Because I've had some bad experiences with people in churches even before coming out. I wound up actually in the past 2 weeks going through kind of a rediscovery phase of this. I wound up going to a Christian summer camp growing up. I went there as a camper for 9 years, and I worked there for a year. And I wound up having in high school a guy as my counselor, who I actually just did an interview on my show. It was my first interview, and the levels got all messed up, so it might be hard to listen to, but it was my first interview. I interviewed him because he had such a profound impact on how my spirituality and my definition of my faith was formed. And one thing I liked is that he wound up leaving the camp at about the same year that I did. But a year later, I found out that he had come out as gay, and he was getting married, and wound up talking to him. He is actually now an atheist. And one of the things that I had based my entire faith on was an event that happened in 2007, where we had this girl in our group who had this issue with her kneecap, where the muscles on the insides of her knees would pull her kneecap out of the bone and grind away the cartilage, and it was very hard for her to walk and very, very painful for her. And then a couple of people in our group wound up falling behind our main group and prayed over it. And there was the whole group wound up experiencing like this faith healing, this miracle, quote unquote. Yeah, I see you rolling your eyes. And as cheesy as it sounds, like that was a huge impact, because being there and experiencing that firsthand was very, very powerful to me and a lot of other people in my group. And I wound up taking that story and telling it in front of Bible studies, in front of church groups, in front of people. When I worked at the camp every week around the campfire during the powerful campfire session where we all talk about really deep stuff, I would wind up telling that story. So I probably told that story more in depth to close to 750, 1,000 different kids. And I wound up talking with my buddy, with James. We reconnected. We haven't talked in like 4 years. But we got on just a Google Hangouts when we were talking about doing the show, and we were chatting about it. And he says, "Well, do you still hold your faith really true?" And I said, "Yeah, it's it's very, very different than what I've seen churches look like, but it still centers around that time in 2007 at the camp. And he just stops me and says, wait, you know that was fake, right? The whole thing was faked. She was an actress. She
Wait, so you gave me crap for rolling my eyes. See, my assumption was it was bullshit. And now you're telling me it was bullshit, yet you still gave me crap for rolling my eyes. That is not fair.
I was poking the wound. Yeah, so just in the past 2 weeks finding out that, I mean, obviously what he says isn't the say all of the whole situation, but hearing that from this guy who spiritually I've looked up to so much, say that the event that my whole spirituality definition centers around was fake, that's incredibly jarring to me. And so I don't know what to think. I at this point, I believe that there's something out there, but I don't know I've never known what it is. I've never known how it works or whatever. So I don't know. It's very much up in the air right now, and it has not settled it at all.
I would say the best thing to do is just to kind of keep your mind open, research, observe life events, things like that. It's just
definitely. I'm getting religious advice from an atheist.
We're the best ones to get it from. No, we really are. Not to bring, I certainly won't bring this show down that road, but I've always said that an atheist is more open-minded than a believer, because if you showed me proof of God tomorrow, I would admit that I was wrong, and I would believe in God. If
you're not tied down to one thing.
If you showed a believer proof that there was no God, they would just blame you as a blasphemer or label you as a blasphemer, and they would say it was God testing their faith. So we're a lot more open-minded than they are. We don't want a world with no God. We want a world with no bullshit. And if you can present us a God that doesn't revolve around bullshit, we're cool.
Yeah.
And obviously your situation revolved around bullshit.
Yeah, that event did. I've never tried to never, like, in the times of my life where I had the strongest faith and the times of my life where I've had the least amount of faith, I've always tried to look at it with a realistic perspective and make my own decisions and not take anything based on what somebody else tells me. Right. So yeah, that's kind of the faith story there.
Yeah. Well, we'll kind of leave that at that, because like I said, I already did a 2.5 hour show with JF. We bring up religion, we'll go all night.
Oh yeah, especially with JF.
Oh yeah. Oh, that was Star Wars, which might as well be religion. Even in our episode 7 spoiler cast last night, the religious ties between Star Wars and religion came up, and I'm like, why does this happen every time?
I want to talk about Star Wars on a show. This isn't going to be a Star Wars show, but holy cow!
No, I did that for 3 hours and 45 minutes last night. That was great.
All right, we'll not do that this week.
So I haven't, again, another question I kind of came up with. So you identify as a gay woman.
Uh-huh.
So you fancy women.
Yep.
It sounds like it's such an old term, but whatever. So for my own curiosity, and I'm sure at least maybe one other person's wondering. So you go to a bar, have a couple drinks, whatever. Are you looking at straight women? Are you looking at gay women? Because you could now are you pre-op?
Yes.
So are you planning on getting that up? Is that a step in your? I mean, if that's too personal, don't answer it. But
as a word of advice for any other trans women or trans men that you talk to, that is an incredibly personal question.
Is it? Okay, I apologize.
Yes. I mean, I can be incredibly blunt. I still have a lady dick.
Okay, no, that's fine. I apologize.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Well, the reason behind that question was because obviously you identify as a woman, which logically would think, okay, a lesbian. But yet, if you're still male physically in some ways,
still top?
Well, no, I'm just wondering, like, is that going to appeal to a lesbian?
That's something that I have absolutely no power. I have no answer to that because I have no power in how other people identify. I've had that come up a lot. straight women won't like me because I am too feminine.
Right.
Lesbian women won't like me because of my anatomy.
Right.
And finding that person that's in the middle that fits just right is incredibly hard. And um, I found one person since coming out, and we actually broke up last month. So
Oh, sorry to hear that. So does
you're glad that we broke up?
no? I said sorry to hear that.
Oh, I thought you said glad to hear
No,
that.
sorry to hear that.
So it's a interesting thing, and it kind of it's very, very, very different than being a guy going to a bar or trying to find somebody, because your selection is much more limited,
Right.
and what exactly are you looking for, and what exactly are other people expecting, and it's it's a very, very difficult thing.
Right. Is it so? Is that something where, like, in a perfect world, would you find another transgendered woman, and or is that a completely different scenario?
And there's I'm trying to think of what his name is. A comedian, but I don't know. But he talks about like how his wife is amazing and she has all these difficult qualities, or all these amazing qualities. But if they were to break up, he'd find somebody else who could be equally as amazing but have a whole set of different qualities.
Right.
And so, I'm sorry, what was the question? I spaced.
The dating another transgendered woman.
Oh, dating another trans person. Finding a trans person to date would be great, because I mean, when I deal with dysphoria, when I get incredibly anxious because someone sees me at a bar who I haven't seen in a few years and calls out my old name, and I start getting really, really anxious and kind of in my own head just going nuts, they'll understand that. So finding somebody who understands that is going to be great, but there's also going to be there's so much more to somebody than that. And so the person that I was dating was cisgendered, meaning that they aren't transgender. She was born a woman, she identifies as a woman, um, and while they didn't understand all of the aspects that go along with having the dysphoria and the anxiety and the panic attacks and that kind of stuff, they made up for it in other ways.
Right.
So finding somebody that the sum of all their good qualities equals X is, I mean, you could find two very, very different people who meet that final sum
Okay.
requirement.
That makes
Does that
sense.
make sense?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, so the biggest thing is just to not find somebody who's necessarily gone down the same path as you, but somebody who accepts and does their best to understand the path you've gone down.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And that probably, yeah. I mean, I guess I'm sure that. I mean, I just can't imagine the nervousness that goes along with that, because I mean, it just for anybody
With the
to
dating
try
world?
for anybody to try to pick somebody up can be frustrating, can be cause anxiety. You go to the bar, you get your eye on somebody, and then you change your mind and go home and have a couple more beers and fall asleep, and
Yeah.
it just seems like yet another hurdle in this already difficult path through life.
And that's one of the things that I've loved about hormones is, I mean, obviously there are physical changes that go along with hormones, but there's equally as many mental changes that go around with it. I am like going through a breakup, like I am handling it so much different than I did before transitioning. And that, like, there's definitely a lower sex drive. There's a definite lower need to go out to a bar and find somebody, or a desire, not necessarily a need, but there's less of a desire to find somebody. And having somebody who you can share that and be a strong companion with is significant, but it's a very, very different feeling. And so there's still that desire of, yeah, that would be nice, but I don't necessarily need that.
Right.
So
What is it? I mean, you brought it up a couple times as far as the hormones, and what is it specifically that they are doing? Is it voice? Is it body form? Is it like
if you take for voice, hormones don't do anything. That's something you do through your own personal training. I've heard that there's surgeries, but I've heard that there's risk that you'll screw your vocal cords up completely. If you take a rubber band or a balloon or something like that and you stretch it out over and over again, you stretch it really tight and then you let go of it, it's not going to shrink back to its normal size. It'll shrink back a little bit, but definitely not to its normal size because it's been stretched too much. Same thing with your vocal cords. When a adolescent male goes through puberty, their vocal cords get stretched, and that's the voice drop that you hear. After a certain period of time, there's no coming back from that.
Right.
And so, and there are different things that at certain times in your life you reach a point where you can't come back from that. At 25, 18 to 25 is when your hip bones fuse together and cannot be moved again. If you start hormones before then, you might wind up with wider hips.
Right.
But I'm not going to get that. Hormones have definitely, the first result I saw was softer skin, some hair loss, as far as body hair. No hair loss on my head. It's actually estrogen is used to fight that sometimes.
Right.
It has obviously breast growth to an extent. How graphic do we want to get?
Well, I went over the line earlier, so whatever you're comfortable saying. I'm simply asking for, like I said, for my own inquiry as well as maybe somebody who's listening, and I don't want to cross that line of maybe I shouldn't have asked that question again. So wherever you're comfortable with going.
Have you ever seen Kill Bill?
Of course.
Of course, yeah. At the beginning, she's in a coma and she wakes up and tries to walk, but her muscles in her legs have atrophied.
Yeah.
Same thing happens with testicles.
Okay.
So after a certain period of time, you've got testosterone telling those things to make semen. And once you block that, I take an estrogen supplement and estrogen supplement and an anti-testosterone supplement that blocks testosterone. Because if you just up the estrogen, your body says, holy shit, there's a ton of estrogen, we need to make more testosterone. You wind up blocking that testosterone that's telling your body to produce this sperm. They are just sitting around, they've got no idea what to do, and they wind up atrophying. So eventually you stop creating that, and they atrophy, and you're no longer able to have kids.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Right. But that's just one of those things where it's part of the process. And
yeah, it is. That was a big thing for me too. Through my deciding to, I knew if I went down this, I'm not going to be able to have a genetic Abby.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, is that something that? Now, obviously, at your point now, that's done. You're beyond that step.
Everyone is different. I've heard of somebody who went 6 months, stopped hormones, tried to have a kid, just couldn't do it. I know I've heard of somebody who went 2 years, stopped doing hormones, and was able to have a kid. At different periods of time, that's the cutoff rate. There's definitely a lower chance for me now. I don't know how slim it is.
Right. But, it's possible, but not likely. Right.
Yeah, and I'm not going to get to a point where I'm ready to have a kid.
Nobody is.
By the time that yeah.
I have 2, and I'm still not ready to have one. But, so I guess to kind of sum this up a little bit, or not sum it up, but to kind of to put some closure on it. So anyone who might be listening and either they themselves or they know somebody, like, what would you say is kind of the best advice? Obviously, again, we talked about how the younger you are when you're certain, getting to that point or getting to that decision at a younger age will provide you with better results as you get older. But so what's some advice that you'd give someone who's maybe questioning or in the process? Or
definitely there are advantages to starting early and getting through processes before you go to college, before you hit puberty, that kind of stuff. But my best advice would be just to go slow. This is the most drastic change that you are ever going to voluntarily put your body through. There's nothing that equates to this, really, I don't think. And you need to make sure that it is, because it's so significant, being sure and being able to kind of humble enough to know that you might not know everything and things change. You're constantly changing. As much as your body changes as you grow up, your mind changes as you grow up as well. And things shift around, things change, and just being able to be sure, I don't regret spending 5 years thinking about this. I don't regret spending 6 months in therapy before I got into hormones. If I was given the option to get on hormones, change my name, have insurance pay for every kind of surgery that I would want, I don't think that would be necessarily a good thing. Being able to go slow enough where you can get what you need before things get drastic. I mean, there's a statistic out there saying 42% of trans women and 48% of trans men will at least attempt to commit suicide sometime in their life because of their dysphoria. And so obviously it can't take too long, but going slow enough to make sure that you're absolutely positive that you need to do this is, I think, very essential to making the most of it and being able to figure things out.
Okay. So kind of while the youth does have the advantages, by no means don't jump into it.
Yeah, don't start taking, if you're 10 years old, or if you're really, don't start hormones because you're young and you want to get the most out of it.
Right.
Start it when you're young because you're absolutely sure.
Right.
And that's not something I've heard other trans people talk about before, but I've made life decisions that I definitely regret before.
Haven't we all?
Exactly. Yeah. And you don't want something this drastic.
Right.
If I realized over the next few months, few years, whatever, that this was a bad idea and I never should have done it, I would have one hell of a time coming back from this.
Right.
I wouldn't be able to do it.
So, is it more difficult to come back than it is to go there in the first place?
I've heard a few stories about it. Obviously, depending on how far you've gone, I mean, there's definitely some changes that I've experienced from hormones that aren't going to go away. I'll still have breasts for the rest of my life. I'll still have, changing my name back 1 month after, or even changing my name twice back to that is going to be very, very difficult. The impact on my family, on my friends, the friends that I've lost because of this, is going to be very hard to come back from as well. So
right,
because there's some things that you're stuck with.
You're kind of in that situation where the friends you have now would almost feel betrayed, maybe, in a way, and then
yeah, definitely
the old friends wouldn't know whether to trust you or whatever word you'd want to use there. And I could see how that would be just kind of not worth the hassle.
Yeah, I got to a point where I realized that this was going to be the only way that I survived. I wasn't going to be able to survive if I didn't do this. And once you get to that point, then moving forward, at the point that I started seeking help or seeking therapy for this, I was in an okay spot. I was definitely not at 100%, but it was definitely a downhill slope, and I knew eventually I would hit bottom.
Right. Well, that works. Once you kind of get over that hill, and things just kind of fall into place, and
yeah, for sure.
So why don't you to kind of close this out? Why don't you tell us a little bit about the show that you do and what other information can be found there, and kind of describe that a little bit.
For sure, yeah. Diary of a Trans Woman. I'm actually going to be recording the 16th episode right after this.
Cool.
I started to realize last Nerdtacular in August that there were a lot of people interested in transgender issues, and I had a voice. I wound up guesting on a couple shows, and I realized that this was something that I could do to get my voice out there. And instead of doing a comedy show or something funny or whatever, doing something that, and you look on iTunes for LGBT podcasts, there's not a ton that are dedicated to transgender issues, and there's not a ton that are dedicated to being there for somebody who is going through the early stages of transition or dealing with the different, I've coined it, the different hurdles that come along with living as a transgender person. And so I started doing this podcast. It's about a half hour, 45 minutes, depending on the week. Just talking about different issues in the LGBT community. It's Diary of a Trans Woman, so we talk about different stuff that's happened with me throughout the week. More and more, I'm realizing my life is kind of mundane, and there's not a ton to talk about.
The more you try and talk about it, the more you realize. I run into that on my other shows. Like, we don't really do that much.
Exactly. Like, all right, I hung around my apartment and I went to my job.
It's like, I'm going to repost last week's episode.
But yeah, so every week I try and come up with a new topic. We've talked about different movements within the community. I mean, the T in LGBT stands for trans with an asterisk, but there's a movement to remove that asterisk because it's become way too inclusive to people. So we talked about that. I'm talking about how to be
what do you
more...
mean by that? Because that...
All right, so trans, the trans label is an umbrella term. That means that there's a ton of different identities that fall under that.
Okay.
Back in the late 80s, early 90s on the internet message boards, trans men, transgender men, women transitioning to be men, started putting an asterisk at the end of trans because the trans label had become very inclusive to just trans women. And so that asterisk was there to be more inclusive to both trans men and trans women. Recently, however, especially due to some guy in Texas who's this straight cisgendered guy who fancies himself an LGBT expert and authority figure, started to use the asterisk, claimed that he had started using the asterisk, and he was the first person to do it, and included a ton of different titles and a ton of different identities that were not part of the transgender label. Two-spirit was a term that he used. Two-spirit is a Native American LGBT term. Gender non-conforming people, which are basically feminine men, masculine women, that kind of thing. They're still cisgendered, but they don't fit the gender expression stereotype, I guess. Right. Cross-dressers, drag queens, drag kings, they've all started to be thrown under this label. And my whole thing is, I mean, back in last summer, you say the people in charge came to the LGBT community and said, "What do you want?" And the whole crowd yelled what they want. And most of the people were yelling marriage equality. So the Marriage Equality Act passed. Now, if you come to the transgender community and say, "What do you want?" and you have all these different groups yelling for different things, you make a huge noise, but it's very, very hard to understand what you want because you don't have this unified, you don't have any kind of common interests. But the trans label was used to stand for transgender. Now it stands for trans with an asterisk, whatever you want to call it. Right. And you've got people in there that it was never intended to include. And so we talked about that. We talked about liberties that LGBT news outlets. So you've got the Advocate and the Washington Blade too. The Washington Blade is what we talked about, a news site that centers around LGBT issues in Washington, D.C., wound up reporting a police standoff with somebody who was attempted to commit suicide, and they knew that the Washington, D.C. has an LGBT liaison unit. They were involved. Yeah, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, it's headed up by a sergeant who's transgender. Wound up calming down the situation and reported it, put in the police report, put in the press conference and whatever, that there was a woman who was attempting to commit suicide and very distraught and wound up firing into an area where police cars were arriving. And this site found out that it was a transgender woman. And while the police department never outed her as transgender, this news outlet decided to go ahead and make a story about how the transgender woman and there was a police standoff. So what rights do LGBT news outlets have when it comes to outing people? Right. And that kind of stuff.
Like the police understood because the captain, you said, was transgender, so they kept the privacy. And then a news outlet that you would think would be respectful enough to keep the privacy, kind of tried to make it there. Like they tried to be the voice of the issue. Maybe they wanted to get it out there as
they took some liberties and they added that transgender. If they didn't add the transgender label to it, though, they wouldn't have a story. So maybe I don't know. It gets into a ton of different categories.
Almost makes it political, which sucks. Almost makes it political, which sucks.
Yeah, and it is. It is very political at times, unfortunately, but. So yeah, just any kind of issues that come up in the culture of the LGBT community, we're talking about that kind of stuff.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I will say, I've had a blast. We're coming up at about an hour and a half here, so I'm probably gonna get ready to close it up here.
Yeah.
I know. That's what I like about this show is that when you talk about yourself, it goes. And I love to listen. I love to learn about people. That's why I started this show. I do want to kind of apologize a little bit. I had a bunch of topics of discussion as far as the geeky side of things, but we had so much fun kind of talking about, who you are as far as your identity. And I was very interested and very compelled. So, I mean, I had a lot of fun.
I'm glad to talk about that. And that's what I'm trying to do as part of this is being an educator in the LGBT community. I've been trying to do that ever since I came out, trying to help people learn. So doing this is definitely in my wheelhouse.
Very cool. So again, it was a blast. I had a lot of fun. And where can the listeners find you?
You can. I am on Twitter at AbbyGeek, ABBYGEK, and you can check out the show. It's on iTunes and Stitcher. Just search any podcast app for Diary of a Trans Woman. Hit me up on Twitter. I'm not on there a ton, but whatever. If you're part of the Tadpole, you know where to find me. Abby West, Abby Wessels on Facebook. So cool, yeah. And yeah, if you want to talk geek stuff, have me on. I'd love to come on again. This has been a blast.
Definitely, we'll turn it around and do the geek half of Abby.
Yeah, for sure.
As for the show, you can follow us on Twitter at IG_MindOfAGeek. You can find the schedule of upcoming guests as well as show notes for all past episodes at inkedgeekstudios.com/mindofageek. If you have a question or comment for an upcoming guest, you can email us at mindofageekpodcast@gmail.com. And as always, if you enjoy the content we provide here at Inked Geek Studios, you can go to patreon.com/IG Studios and help show your support. Abby, it was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Definitely. And everyone who was listening, thank you for listening.